Hello, and welcome to the Oda Nobunaga Archives. I'm your host, Terry Curtis. This is my first episode and my first podcast, actually, and maybe there will be more. Who knows? We'll see how this one goes. On today's episode, the name is Nobunaga, a reintroduction to the Christian daimyo. Before we begin, I would like to give a shout out to Connor Jones of Ithaca College for providing artwork for today's episode. If you would like to see more of him, you can find him on Instagram at ConnorJFull_Meishu. That is ConnorJFull_MEISHU. So, as we begin our discussion and journey into Oda Nobunaga's relationship to Christianity, I would like everyone to pause for a moment. When you think of Oda Nobunaga in pop culture, anime, or manga, what do you picture? Got it? Well, for me, I always pictured a Western-looking man who is brutish, violent, but also smart. But recently, I don't think the Western attire really fits him, and we will continue to explain why later in the podcast. So, to start this discussion, I would like to start off with some historical context. So, we'll start off with a brief history of Oda Nobunaga himself. We're not going to go into too much depth because the podcast will be centered around his relationship with Luis Freud as well as Alessandro Valignano. So, Oda Nobunaga was born June 23rd, 1534, in the Owari province of Japan, and died on June 21st, 1582. So he actually committed seppuku or harakiri. They are interchangeable words, which literally mean belly cutting, and this was a honorable form of suicide, which was favored under the Code of Bushido. So he committed seppuku because one of his retainers attempted to assassinate him, and before he had the chance to actually collect Oda Nobunaga's head, he committed suicide. So Oda Nobunaga lived during the end of the Sengoku Jidai, which lasted from 1467 and 1615. This period saw civil unrest and the factioning of Japan, in which different provinces and territories would fight for control of the shogunate, which was essentially the military dictator of Japan and was really the ruling class under the emperor, but the emperor was more of a figurehead. So during the end of this period, Oda Nobunaga and two others, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, were the three big unifiers of Japan. During Nobunaga's reign, he would go on to conquest, and the result of this conquest was the control of a majority of Honshu, Japan's main island. The crescent. Through this conquest, he was able to consolidate his rule in his home province of Owari due to familial disputes of succession, as his brother was a bastard in a sense, as his mother was not Oda Nobuhide's actual wife, but was more of a mistress or concubine. So he would come in conflict with many enemies through his conquest, and these enemies included both samurai, daimyo, and Buddhists that opposed his rule. Those who did face him faced extreme violence from the Oda forces. The greatest example of this that I would like to point out is the burning of Mount Hiei. So we have a picture here that I would like to bring up. I hope you guys can see it if I set this up correctly. This is from the video game Total War Shogun 2. I would highly recommend it. It does a great job of representing Japan through an accurate historical sense. And the Ikoiki were an autonomous group of people that were backed by the Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. So it was a particular sect of Buddhism. As you can see here in this picture, there are warrior monks wielding spears. So this anonymous group was made out of peasants, merchants, traders, religious monks, and they became militarized. So, because of their Buddhist nature, they directly opposed the daimyo's rule as well as the samurai class, and they began to gain a large amount of influence and power within Japan, and Nobunaga saw that as a threat. In retaliation to their opposition, Nobunaga razed the entire mountain, killing all warrior monks, men, women, and children that lived on the mountain. He did not spare anyone and cut down the opposition. As you can see, Nobunaga's methods were extremely harsh and brutish during this warring period in which there was much death and violence. Now, his violence and brutalness is not debated, as we have historical accounts from both Jesuit priests and other historical scribes who wrote down these accounts. So this ties in directly to Nobunaga's support of the Jesuits during this time period. The Jesuits during this time period were on a mission to spread the word of God and to convert other nations to Christianity. However, in Japan, there was a large issue: Buddhists and their control. So, take a quick guess and think why Nobunaga and the Jesuits would become friends. All right, got your guess? Well, one simple reason that many authors have debated was that the Jesuits and Buddhists were natural enemies, which is why Nobunaga had accepted them in his domain. As they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But as we have here in the documents, such as Louis Froh's Historia de Japan, the debate lies in why he supported them, not whether he supported them. As Nobunaga would be fighting off different Buddhist powers that had been defying his rule, he was adamant about secular rule, which aligned himself with both great unifiers, Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, as I mentioned earlier. In his secular rule, he did not want to or practice any form of religion, whether it was Buddhist or Buddhism, Shintoism, or Christianity. And those who had become close to him, particularly Louis Froh, had noted that Nobunaga did in fact detest religion. And my main argument is that Nobunaga would not have converted to Christianity, as other authors have argued. During this period, it is speculated that Nobunaga possibly would have converted to Christianity by multiple historians, and even Jesuits themselves during this period, had he not had that assassination attempt on his life. But I do not think this is true for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, the Jesuits in their writings are self-serving, and their entire mission is to spread the word of God to others and convert other nations. As they are self-serving and biased, they thought they could make this impossible task possible. And so one thing that Louis Froh had said is that it does give some hope when one sees that God has chosen him, Nobunaga, to destroy and reduce the sects of Bonzes or Buddhists. As noted, the Jesuits believed that Nobunaga was an act of God to help spread their word, and therefore he was a possible convertee. As stated by Louis Froh in his Historia de Japan, I know it sounds weird, but Japan, it is spelled with an M. He explains that although they did not have high hopes for conversion, they did think it was possible. I think this is a very narrow-minded and self-centered analysis of the situation. As Jeroen Lamers argues, Nobunaga was not opposed to religion, but what he was opposed to was the militarization of these religions. By circumstance, it was the Buddhists that had become militarized and fought against Nobunaga. Thus, he felt threatened and went to war against them. The Jesuits simply did not do this, and therefore they were not a threat to Nobunaga's power and rule. another popular theory of why Nobunaga had kept the Jesuits in his domain and allowed them free reign was that he needed to gain Western resources. But this does not also seem to be quite accurate as well. Nobunaga was a heavy user of Western military tactics as well as Western novelties, weapons, etc. However, the Jesuits were not the only method of obtaining trade from other people. As Nobunaga was a central power, he did not make use of Port Nagasaki, which was on the southern island of Japan, right off of Honshu. And in Nagasaki, the Jesuits had an enormous presence, but could not be kicked out by Hideyoshi and Ieyasu as they tried to earlier, due to the fact that they did not have other means of gaining these resources. However, the Portuguese had made it up into the Bay area off of Owari province, in which Oda Nobunaga was in fact able to trade. So he did not necessarily need the Jesuits, and was not mandatory for his military success, nor his interest in Western novelties such as clothes or armor. And also, he used trading guilds as another means of obtaining saltpeter, which was used for these firearms. It's quite fascinating. So, likewise, some of his Buddhist foes also had means of obtaining these Western guns, such as the Ishiyama Honganji. They were a Buddhist sect of the Iko-Iki, and were able to produce on the same level firearms as Nobunaga. So therefore we can see that Jesuits were not mandatory for Nobunaga's success, so he did not necessarily need them, but yet why would he still let them reign in his land? Now here is where I've done extensive research and not found much material on. Others have argued, though, that in fact he used Jesuits themselves as a mode of warfare, or Christian daimyos as a mode of warfare, but no one has necessarily said that he used Jesuits themselves as a mode of warfare. I primarily argue this because he granted Louis Foy Shuin, I believe I'm saying that right, which essentially was a declaration or a pass for Mr. Foy and his missionaries to preach within Nobunaga's domain and go freely as they please. I think this is important because Christian thought could have unified the subjects of his domain, but also the subjects of other domain. I say this because the subjects would be loyal to their father due to the Christian religion, or the missionaries, and would resist Buddhist uprisings. Not only would this be a defensive strategy within his own domain, I apologize for that. This is Alessandro Villanano. But he could also use the Jesuits as an offensive strategy. As noted by Alessandro Villanano, many missionaries would reject Japanese culture, which would lead to persecution by local daimyos. As he quotes, "To regard Japanese customs invariably as abnormal and to speak disparagingly of them. When I first came to Japan, ours," the crowd usually follows the leader, "showed no care to learn Japanese customs, but at recreation and on other occasions were continually carping on them, arguing against them and expressing their preference for our own ways, to the great chagrin and disgust of the Japanese." As you can see, these Jesuits were persecuted because they would not assimilate into Japanese culture, and this is actually what is presented through one of the most famous movies of this time period, which was Silence by Martin Scorsese. But Silence, as I will show you, was actually based on a book. Oh, my apologies. Silence is based off of Chinmoku. I apologize, I couldn't remember the name. In which it goes on to find two young Portuguese missionaries landing in Japan, and their conflicts with the local warlord or inquisitor, as they call him. And this was adapted onto the silver screen, and I highly recommend it. It will bring another layer to this podcast. But as we were saying, many of these Jesuits, such as in Silence, did not adapt to Japanese culture and actually resented it, saying their life is worse or more savage than the Jesuits. So, as I would say, these missionaries drew the ire of local warlords, and they would have to operate underground at the local level rather than at the higher level. Through history, in China specifically, many missionaries tried to go from a top-down approach, trying to convert the leaders first rather than the local level, because that's where they assumed all the power was. But by changing thought at the local level, I think this is what's quite important, because by converting locals in a primary Buddhist domain, you will have a population who directly opposes the ruling Buddhist monk or monks, and will then ally with a Christian daimyo, and most likely Oda Nobunaga, as he was the largest powerhead at the time. And Oda Nobunaga allowed for religious freedom in his domain, which was quite progressive at the time. So this new understanding of Oda Nobunaga will change the way that we look at him historically, as well as in pop culture. Because it brings forth a new layer to his character in which we can understand him now as a true master strategist. Although it is true that Nobunaga did love Western novelties and foreigners, he is, in pop culture manga, depicted as a Western samurai, wearing Western clothes and armor rather than a traditional Japanese attire. We know that he did have a collection of foreign objects and clothing. However, I do not think the defining characteristics of his depiction should be his love for Western things. Instead, I want to redefine Oda Nobunaga's image to something that I would argue is more historically accurate. So, moving on to our next point, here are some examples of Oda Nobunaga's depiction in pop culture. On the left, we have a manga based all around Oda Nobunaga. And this, you can see he's wearing a Western cuirass with the medal, which was not traditionally worn in the Sengoku Jidai period, as well as a cape. However, I would like to point out that he actually did, in fact, have a cape, as noted by Louis Fra. But I do not believe he would wear this into battle. Secondly, we have two video games, Nioh, which follows both of these are historical fiction, Samurai Warriors 4 and Nioh, in which in Nioh, in this historical fantasy game, you play as William Adams, a sailor who goes to Japan in search of Edward Keeley, and he fights yokai, or spirits, which are disrupting Tokugawa Ieyasu's plan for unifying Japan. This is past Oda Nobunaga's death. However, he is revived by Edward Kelly. He's the bad guy. And so as Nobunaga is arrested, you can clearly see, just like the picture on the left, he is wearing a cape with a very Western flared neck, and Western cuirass with a beautiful design on its chest plate. And this goes the same for the Samurai Warriors 4, in which he is depicted wearing large pauldrons, which Japanese samurai would not wear. They would wear flat pieces of cloth overlaying one another to create almost a shell. And the third and last, or fourth and last depiction is Oda Nobunaga from Fate Stay Grand Knight. Although he looks quite young in this, having long flowing hair, you can notice he actually does have a piece from his remodeled armor set. Because we do not actually have any of Oda Nobunaga's actual armor. This is what many people imagined would be on his head plate. But notice how it's on almost a Western-looking general's hat. I question why that is. That, to me, that doesn't necessarily make sense for him. Same thing with the cape. So, as you can see, the defining characteristics here is that he's Western, but there have been no indications that he was actually Christian, converted to Christian, or actually supported the Jesuits' missions. But instead, he used them in order to further his own power in Japan, to unify Japan under one shogunate. And he was successful up until he had passed away. So my new pop culture renditions were actually drawn by Connor Jones. But before I show you the picture, I would like to first point out that I did not tell him how I wanted Connor to draw this new rendition of Oda Nobunaga. Instead, I let him have free reign, and this is what he came up with. As you can see here, his coat actually does include the mon, or it's a symbol of your clan. And this is precisely what I expected of a manga version of Nobunaga. Notice he is wearing a Western-style robe with a flared neck. This attire would have been something he would have obtained through the Jesuits and trading with the Portuguese. Another interesting thing to note on the wardrobe is the mon, like I said. So these are signified your family clan and where the individual belonged to, as I said earlier. However, I think it's kind of cool that he meshed the two. But then I revealed the nature of my product, and this is how he changed it. I understand it's a portrait, and it's not very... you can't really see the full body picture, but we have one after this. But he changed it to how I would like to have him represented, and the detail I had him change was that he's wearing a kamishimo, which is a Japanese outfit made up of a katakino, a kimono, and a hakama. And these were worn by samurai and courtiers during the Sengoku Jidai and the later Edo periods of Japan. So this would be more historically accurate, in my opinion. And then this is a full manga panel with a younger version of Oda Nobunaga. As you can see, he is wearing a full kamishimo outfit with the kimono up here and the hakama down here, as well as having a traditional katana, wakashi. You can't really see it, but it's on the side here. I also had him put in arrows being fired at him, because although some of his opponents did use firearms, many did not, and resulted to arrow volley. And so during this one, if I was to make a full manga, I would have this scene be at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. And this battle saw the effective use of firearms by Nobunaga's forces against the sieging Takeda, who were trying to capture Nagashino Castle. Takeda Katsuyori assumed that since it had rained the night before, Nobunaga's gunpowder would be wet and useless, but this was wrong and went precisely as Nobunaga had planned, utilizing his firearms to his full potential. So that is our podcast for today. I hope you guys have learned something, but I hope this can change the minds and hope people can look at Oda Nobunaga in a more historically accurate light, not just thinking that his defining characteristic is that he's Western, but instead he's a master strategist. He's brilliant in his tactics and was very unconventional for the time. But unconventional does not mean he's Western. Thank you for tuning into my podcast, and maybe we'll see. I'm going to post this up on YouTube. If anyone likes it, maybe we'll do another episode. Thank you.